here. So my name is Victoria Jari.
Oh,
It's totally fine. So I do private and cooperative forest management for DNR based out of Tower. Most of the work that I do is site visits with landowners, talking about forest management. A small percentage of my work is urban and community forestry. So that's what we're going to focus on today. So our urban tree canopy is really important to us. It kind of helps build those vital environmental and social benefits, helps with our stormwater, cleaning the air, and just generally improves mental health and reducing the effects of a heat island in urban communities. So the urban and community forestry program's goal is to sustain Minnesota's community programs and help them manage diverse and healthy urban tree canopies that are resilient against climate change. So I'm going to make a plug here for our annual forest health report. You can find that on the DNR's website. They issue usually one of these once a year. 2023 is on there, so it talks about trends in forest health and things to keep an eye on. We're going to talk about some climate related things. So we know that we've seen some changes in our climate. We've seen more days over 90 degrees than historically we experience, and the low temperatures of the winter are higher. We're just not seeing those -40 streaks like we used to. So increased precipitation could aid in tree vigor and growth, but we're also seeing these larger amounts of rainfall we experienced this year, definitely, where we're getting just localized flooding, which is detrimental to trees. So in the Arrowhead, concerns are going to be a little bit different than maybe down in the cities or Rochester, different species distribution. So what we're concerned about here in Ely and generally in the Arrowhead, emerald ash borer continues to march north. I know there's some populations in town, Silver Bay, Two Harbors. There's a population in the woods and Reamer. None of these places are terribly far away. No reports yet in Ely. It's something to keep an eye on. Dutch elm disease, this dates back decades, continues to be a problem. Spongy moth kind of ebbs and flows. Oak diseases, forest tent caterpillar, drought, and then flood events. So kind of going clockwise, starting in the top left, is an elm tree suffering kind of from Dutch elm disease. And then in that middle photo, that's Cook this past spring, this summer, flooding. And then in the middle here, these two, try to hit the laser here. There we go. This is a street lined with ash in Ohio. So this is the before and this is the after. And we have forest tent caterpillars. We're due for one of these infestations pretty soon. And then on the lower right, we have oak wilt. So emerald ash borer, that's going to be our main concern up here in Ely. We don't have a known population or infestation yet, but we do want to keep an eye out. Oops. You're going to look for these serpentine feeding galleries that the larvae make, and this epicormic branching on the bole or the trunk of the tree, and woodpeckers feeding on the tree is a good indication that there are bugs in that tree. So I have some insect ID sheets out on the table and some other handouts. We often see emerald ash borer being confused with some native insects like Laurentian tiger beetle and other green things, but we need observers in the community to report back and tell us what they're seeing if they see something like this, so we can catch it early. We're in the Great North. It gets cold in the winter. We all know that. Our lows aren't as low as they used to be. This could affect how much emerald ash borer survives on an annual basis. The spread north into Minnesota has been slower than Wisconsin and Michigan, likely because we get a little colder up here, but there's some critical points for emerald ash borer mortality. So at 0 degrees, about 5% of the population dies. At -10, about 34%, -20, 79%. And then once you hit -30, 98% of them die, which we didn't, I don't think we hit -30 last year. Some years we do, some years we don't. We're just hoping that we hit -30 once a year to keep that population in check. There are quarantine zones. These are updated as new infestations are found. Just know that the regulated articles, ash logs, tree waste, chips and mulch, and firewood. So strongly discourage anyone you know that's coming from an area infested with emerald ash borer to not bring any ash products north or outside of that quarantine zone to slow the spread. So as far as our urban trees go, so this is the 2010 urban tree inventory for St. Louis County. Ash here is number 3. So we have almost 90,000 ash trees, urban ash trees in St. Louis County. And the 2010 Ely Urban Tree Survey. So again, it's number 3, nearly 2,000. So they count the trees, I believe it's 60 feet off of the street. So some on private land, some boulevard trees, some in city parks, that type of thing. So high amount of ash that could potentially be affected by our emerald ash borer. Dutch elm disease, I'm sure people in this room are familiar with this one. This continues to crop up and be a problem. You can kind of slow the spread or prevent the spread. It's a fungus. It is spread by bark beetles or a vascular system or through root grafts of the tree. So you can reduce breeding sites by removing infected wood, pruning branches, severing root grafts, or using fungicide treatments. Spongy moth. This is kind of what I read, kind of a stable population right now. There were some localized defoliation events, but monitoring happens every summer, and this is one that we like to keep an eye on and count on observations. Everyone's seen those little boxes hanging on trees, so keep an eye on that one. Two-line chestnut borer in oak trees, since we don't have chestnuts. This is increasing in occurrence down in like the central part where you have more dominant oak forests. We do have some oak forests around the Ely area, and it has the potential to spread north. Oak are a more common urban tree, so that's what we want to keep an eye on and make sure that we're not, if we're seeing it, we're treating it early. Forest tent caterpillars, we are due for an infestation. Everyone remembers this event and the photo from 2001, 2002, when they were all over the place. It's just a wait and see game, kind of. Larch beetle, so this is going to be in our tamarack. This might be in some of your urban adjacent areas. Eastern larch beetle is a native pest. It feeds on the cambium, the inner bark of the tree, and kind of cuts off the vascular system. And what happens when you have mass mortality is water table rises, the area floods out, and then it's really hard to get anything established there. And it can flood out adjacent stands. So we've seen this a lot more kind of by Kabetogama, to some extent in Barris and Babbitt, where there are more tamarack stands. So 2023, we had about 262,000 acres impacted by Eastern larch beetle, mostly in this Koochiching County area. But you'll see some down in southern St. Louis County, kind of in that cotton area where there's more lowlands. Tamarack is still a good tree. It's just it grows kind of in a monoculture naturally, and those stands tend to be the most impacted by larch beetle. So we're looking at diversifying our stands, throwing in black spruce to slow eastern large beetle. It's a native pest, but because we're not reaching those low lows, more of the larvae survive every winter, and they're now able to get in 2 life cycles every summer instead of 1. So we just have more of them on the landscape. Spruce budworm, everyone's familiar with this one. This is our local menace. Continues to be a problem. So the numbers, they're the highest they've ever been since 1961. You can see kind of those fluctuating patterns, but we've been on this steep increase. Maybe we'll see numbers like there were in the 50s and 60s. So here, DNR flies defoliation flight every year, and these are the areas that are lightly, moderately, or severely impacted. You can see the bulk of the infestation is kind of along the shore and over that Cook and Lake County border. The bulk of the infestation, so 1995 to 2000, it was up in Kabetogama and slowly marched east to where it is today. So infestations generally last 5 to 10 years, but we've seen some persistent populations in the area. This is a big contributing factor to wildfire risks. There are large fires. Balsam fir, which spruce budworm feeds on, is a perfect ladder fuel and can increase fire activity severity. So here's the greenwood fire scar, and here is the spruce budworm defoliation. So you can see where it was, there was a lot of budworm activity. Some options for private landowners. If you're looking to manage your forest for spruce budworm, you can contact me about DNR cost share, and we'll work to set up a project and give landowners a financial incentive to help pay for practices. And there's some other grant opportunities available. There's no indication it's slowing down. It's kind of been a persistent problem in the Arrowhead. We have more balsam fir on the landscape than we've ever had due to, fire suppression efforts. So budworm may or may not run out of its source. Its favorite thing to eat, balsam fir, but I'd suspect it's going to be persistent. Oak wilt, so these are just something to keep on your radar and not something that's going to impact the Ely area right now. The oak range is kind of in this Pine County, Carlton County area, but oak wilt, the extent of it is to the north end of Pine County. And it's impacting about 40% of Minnesota's red oak group. If you drive up from the cities and you've seen a lot of dieback and oak, it's probably due to oak wilt or a 2-line chestnut borer. Also, drought is impacting our forest health, our urban trees. Probably after 2021, you saw our urban trees are very stressed. Maybe you had to cut some yard trees. It was just too dry. It also is causing uptick in bronze poplar and bronze birch borers. So 2024 trends, you may have noticed on your drives, probably about 6 weeks, 2 months ago, a lot of the aspen was looking very sparse in the top. This is due to this Marsonina leaf spot disease. There are also leaf rolling insects that I just learned about them this year. So they get in the leaf and they roll it up, and I guess that's where they live. Nothing to be terribly concerned about. The tree should rebound just fine and leaf back naturally next summer. But because it was so wet this year, we're seeing a lot more fungal diseases. Bur oak blight and other leaf diseases on oak again. We've seen a prevalence in oak diseases and fungal pathogens, something we're keeping an eye on. So if you have a diseased oak, take some pictures of it, send it to your extension or tree health service provider and try to determine what it is so we can make a better effort on a landscape level to treat these things. Spruce budworm continues to be persistent across the Arrowhead. we're hoping to make efforts, between DNR, Forest Service, the counties, private landowners to manage our forests, reduce the volume of balsam fir on the landscape, and try to eliminate that food source for budworm and reduce our fire hazard. General oak decline. I have some handouts on oak decline. If you have some declining oak, it could be a myriad of things that's happening. We would like more information on what's going on. So you can go out to the table. I have my card out there and some pamphlets to look at. And get engaged in your community if you want to help out with your urban trees. There's forest pest first detectors, a certification course. I don't think it's been offered recently, but I would just say get familiar with the health of your urban trees and just track the, if they're looking kind of wilty, if there's something, a big change in them, that's your local urban forest professionals are going to want to know about that. And if you find emerald ash borer, you're going to want to report a pest online. So to replace ash, we're going to look at some climate adapted species, something that we know is going to live on the landscape for a long time and can more easily cope with higher temperatures or more rainfall. So NIAX, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, came up with this great handout of what tree species have a poor capability, a fair capability, and a good capability of adapting to a warmer and wetter climate. I have these handouts out on the table, but I would encourage you to take a look at this. And if you're going to replace an urban tree, probably select one of these that has a better capability of adapting to our changing climate. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Sonja. I think we'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Awesome. Well, okay, that's all. Well, she gets it. Yeah, I'm Sonja Tosteson from the University of Minnesota, Urban Forestry Outreach and Research Lab. I have my colleague here, Ryan Murphy, the one describing the beautiful loon that was up here earlier for the silent auction. I'll be talking today on some time appropriate things you can do this fall for tree care, especially for trees that are newly planted or maybe younger in development, and then also just some pruning tips as well, and mostly preparation for pruning later this winter. So again, happy to take questions when we'll be here a little bit after. So awesome, cool. Not so many things. All right, so winter's coming. What we're going to talk about is, how can you prepare your trees for the winter months? I grew up in Chisago County. I live in the Twin Cities, and we're up in Ely. And so timing wise, when typically it gets colder here sooner, but it's almost exactly the same temperature this week in the cities as it is here. So it's weird. And so sometimes you have to adapt what you do. This October for us at least has been a bit warmer and definitely drier. So we're kind of postponing some things we would normally be doing, but we adapt. And then we'll talk a little bit about pruning. I'll try not to talk too fast, but I get very excited. And I love talking about all of these things. Awesome. Oh, that was me. So a bunch of different things. And for some of you, obviously these are, reinforcing knowledge you might have, but you might, it's always good to think about things in a new way, maybe see a new picture that jogs a memory. But water in winter, how much should you be watering? Some things you want to think about is in general, not just in the fall, but how water is moving through your site. So especially if you're talking about yard trees, or if you live more in the city or in town or in a development where that soil has been changed around and moved around a lot and manipulated, and every year is different. I know up here it was really wet the first half of the summer, and then it became really dry. So if it's been dry for a long time, water's gonna, when it does rain, water will move differently, typically faster get absorbed. But Oh, newly planted trees. So fall is a great time to plant. Shameless plug or non-shameless plug. Claudia over here is hosting a planting on Saturday where they're going to plant around 13 or 17 trees. So fall is a great time to plant. You can also oftentimes get things on sale, which is great. But depending on the size of the tree, a general guideline is giving them about 10 to 15 gallons of water, and then they want about no, 2 to 3. You want to water them a couple times every week with maybe 2 to 3 gallons, depending on the size. But that's kind of an average rule for the younger trees and freshly planted. And then sometimes some of you might know this, but you're going to want to water for up to the first 3 to 5 years. So it takes trees a while to get established in their new location, and watering less frequently, but deeper. So don't just scatter some water on, multiple times a week, that might just evaporate. So those are some good tips. And obviously water or how much it rains from the sky will affect how much you want to water. So ideally at 1 inch rainfall a week is great. And if you have trees that you want to water that are larger, really the big thing you want to do is make sure it's getting down at least 6 to 9 inches into the soil depth. And you're going all the way out to that drip line, if not further. It's a lot of work to water a mature tree, so maybe pick your favorites, or that's your shtick, that's your Netflix, is just watching the water come. What's also a good option. With something like drip tape over here, drip irrigation, hose, all that. And then we talked about watering. Drought conditions might change things too. So when should you stop watering? Anybody know? Never. Water throughout the year. Generally, we want to be watering until the ground freezes. So we don't recommend a specific date because obviously the ground, when it freezes, will change depending on climate and weather in your particular area. But it is important to keep on watering, even trees that you planted that spring, because they're still growing and it's great. And when the tree goes dormant. So for deciduous trees, that's probably pretty obvious when they start to lose their leaves. For conifers, it's more like, okay, when's the ground freezing? Because they don't go dormant in the same dramatic way as a deciduous tree. Yep, we mentioned, great time to plant. Water bags, anybody ever use one of these? Oh, 2 people, yes, awesome. Well, great learning moment. So watering bags can be a great option. They just zip around your tree and then you stick a hose in a hole in the side. They slowly percolate down. But we always recommend for those of you that do use them, take them off in the winter because it's like a really nice mouse house that it'll go in there and then they'll eat your tree. So stem protection, it's really important for the winter. There's many reasons people use them. Critters is probably the number one, anything from a mouse to probably not a moose, that's really intense, although you might, but to a deer. And snowdrifts, so especially if you have little trees that you're trying to protect from when your snow blower or your snow plow comes through, you want to protect them from those dramatic movements of the snow so they don't tip over. And also, fun fact, some people might know, young stems do photosynthesize. It's not just leaves. So buds can actually photosynthesize different parts of the tree. It's really cool. So especially if you have a younger tree that you planted this year in the past couple of years, you want to make sure that you're not covering it up too much. You don't generally want to use those opaque, like white tubing and leave those on during the winter time. They create a nice little critter area, but also they prevent the stem from photosynthesizing. So you can do like these ones on the right there. It's hard to tell. They look kind of peach, but they're actually, they let certain wavelengths of light through as well as air. You can see they're called grow tubes. So those we leave on many of our trees. You can do it for years. Depends on how fast your tree is growing. Elms are fast growers, so typically not as long on them, but just depends on your site. So stem protection, you want to talk about, so now is a great time to assess taking off maybe what you've put on for the summer. So I usually do tall bag. We're kind of going fast through this, but you put on stems to protect them. What you're protecting them from varies. So in the summertime, a lot of times it'll be weed whackers, mowers, kids. You might be, let's see, obviously, yeah, deer, big one, deer, rabbits. And so you'll think about, if I'm doing something for a deer protecting, it might be different than what material I'd use for a weed whacker. Deer, you're probably looking at more of a fencing situation and taller. Weed whacker, you might use like a little small white tubing to protect it. Also, reflectivity can be important, especially if you're if you do a lot of work during dawn or dusk. So you know where the trees are and you don't run them over with a mower, especially if they're small. We have how tall, so that does vary. I'm not using my voice so loud. Was so tall. Deer obviously can get up, I think 8 feet is the recommended fence height. If you have one tree, that's going to look different than if you have a bunch of trees. So they really love, northern white cedar, white pine, a lot of different things. They get hungry enough. If you do put it up for something like rabbits, just watch for as the snow gets higher, the rabbits are able to go up higher, or any matter of creature for that. And then they'll girdle your trees by just nibbling around. And it's kind of fun to look at, but it's not fun to deal with. Then you have to plant a new tree and it's kind of sad. And then how wide is it? So if you're looking for a weed whacker, you can get pretty close, but if you're looking for, something that can reach through, or like a mouse or something, you're going to want smaller hardware cloth, a little further out so they can't nibble in there. But in general, you want something that's not like this. So you do want to always check it, like that middle picture there. That is not very effective. It's actually probably at the point where it might start girdling the tree. So it'll cause the tree to kind of get choked. And it's not really protecting it at this point. So that's kind of improper. We have great videos on, how to choose the right stem protection for your tree online too. And then if you do have something like deer, considering adding like a top to your fencing too. Not as common, but can be done. And then obviously with snow up here changing, we mentioned those rabbit levels. So just making sure, I've had some people that double stack their tubing because they're like in preparation for, they know the snow is going to get high and they're not going to be on the site. So that can be something you can consider. Fencing is more of an investment, time, energy, and money, but can be really effective depending on what your pressures are. And then of course, reassess come springtime. So some protection guards that you want, like for weed whackers, you can take off in the winter and then put them back in the spring. Some you can leave on all year long. Some you definitely want to be checking though, because your tree is growing. Countless times you see, especially if with people that have trees planted for them or something, the stem protection is like growing into the tree, which is kind of cool art project, a good silent auction item, but not good for the health and longevity of that tree. And just kind of quick, just removing all of the ties. So, and checking your swing sets. If you have kids or grandkids, or you have tire swings, or tarps, or if you're a camper, things that you've attached to the tree. Just checking those out. Fall's a great time to do that. Take them off and check your staking. So we don't always recommend staking, but if you have staked your tree, maybe it's a windy spot, check it out. See, if it's been more than a season, you want to make sure you're assessing it to see whether you should take off the stakes and the staking materials or not. Anybody use mulch? Anyone use mulch? Have you ever seen a mulch volcano? Sounds really cool. Someone's like, we don't have volcanoes in Minnesota. And I was like, we do. So it's a good thing to check in the fall if you are a mulch user, or if you see maybe you're on the volunteer team here. They pile it up and you pile it up too close to the stem and it creates this nice little, again, a nice little mouse house. It also has, as it biodegrades, it becomes kind of soil-like, and so the roots will grow up into it and start circling the tree itself and can choke it out and kill it eventually. So you want to do more of a donut shape on the right, and fall is a great time to kind of pull it away from the stem and check it, and make sure that it is helping your tree and not unintentionally harming it. So kind of do a little bit here on pruning. So fall is a great time to think about dormant season pruning. Anybody know why we prune in the dormant season, which when the leaves are off deciduous tree? Yeah, so there's less of a chance that you're spreading insects and diseases. They're either not there or they're in a different life stage. Yeah, anybody else? Yeah. Yeah. Someone said, I realize I should be repeating through Zoom. Someone said it doesn't shock the tree as much, the water movement. So yeah, the tree has kind of gone down into its like lower energy mode. Anybody else? The sap is retreating. Yeah, so that kind of goes with, yeah, it's kind of shutting down, it's slowing down. So you're making less of an impact that way. It can also be really great. You see the structure of the tree. So if you're pruning and you're like, oh, the rubbing branches, you know, when there's a full canopy, you can't necessarily see everything that is in that tree, but you can if it's leafless. So great reasons people plant a tree. I always like to remind people pruning is indeed wounding. You are, you know, removing part of a tree. So it's important to do it for a reason. And there's lots of great reasons. People do mitigate storm and weather damage. So I know that happens. It's been super windy here. So, you know, maybe one of these days a branch limb comes off and you want to clean it up. We've had a huge, at least 2 or 3 big storms in the cities, and our municipal crews have been kind of overwhelmed with the work for just that reason. Wildlife damage, clearance and trucks, common to be 14, 15 feet, garbage trucks, you know, and if you prune it before the truck gets there, then you have a nice clean cut versus the truck pruning when they tear it out, which does happen. Good structure, it's a little subjective, but there are some objectives like preventing tear outs. That's just like where a whole limb tears down a part or all of the way to the ground. Removing codominant leaders. So when you're talking about trees that you want in your yard, especially shade trees, you usually want one strong central trunk or main stem. If you have 2, that kind of creates a weak point where it can tear out or they can split. So you want to remove those codominant stems. Does that include pine trees? I haven't worked extensively with those. They seem to be a different situation, right? Have you worked codominance in pines or conifers? Yeah. So it's a little situationally dependent, like where along, like how high off the ground. If it's an indication that there's a different issue going on. I'd say if it's low to the ground, you might, but it would be a different strategy. So great question though. Increasing air movement. We talked a little bit about fungi. So this year's been crazy for fungus. They're just having such a great, at least the first half of the summer up here. And so you can create that good airflow so their spores are less likely to transfer, and reducing the sail. So that's like how big the canopy is. So that if, you know, all that, a really big gust comes up, there's less pull and torque on those branches. And so they're less likely to snap. And then of course, aesthetics like this bonsai tree. That's a Scots pine, if anybody knows, at the state fair this year. So there's any reason to prune. We talked a little bit about here, big one, pests and diseases. So that's a huge one. Tree has likely gone into dormancy, easier to see the structure. We didn't talk about this, but if you're pruning like larger limbs or you have a company come in, that snowpack's providing a bit of a buffer. So the soil will be a bit more protected than it would be if that machinery was directly on top from compaction. I will say fruit trees are a whole different, if you're pruning for production of fruits, kind of talking mostly about shade trees, but you can prune those typically in late winter for their growth later in the year. In the summertime, you only prune for diseases and deadwood. Cool. All right, just a couple more tips. It's great right now to mark I couldn't find the image of like a tie, like, so I put a tie on there of like a stem tie of like a flagging. So that's why there's a tie on the board. But pick a method you remember. So think about your trees, you know, think about like right now you're like, oh, obviously I remember this. I can even take a picture. And then come 5 months from now, you're like, I took a picture. I have no idea where this was. So pick whatever method works for you. I like handwriting down notes. I'm a big person. It just helps me remember. Some people take notes on their phone or they geotag it, and that's great. And then they say what branch on the northeastern side, and they note the species, you know, whatever works for you. It's great to mark it now because a lot of things look dead in the wintertime. So you don't want to prune the wrong branch, and this will help prevent that. You also, if you have power lines near you, maybe you have some running through your backyard, that stay away, you know, stay away, stay alive, 15 feet at least, any part of the tree, whether or not it's the part you're cutting or not. you should be working with a professional municipal arborist so they can make sure the power's turned off and you don't accidentally injure yourself or others. General recommendations for when you're pruning. How many people here prune their trees regularly? So some people do. Okay. You'll all really want to prune after this. Kind of if you see people out pruning, or if you want to join the local tree steward pruning group that Claudia helps run, you want to, at any given time, you want at least, so the green, for simplicity's sake, it's the green bit that's photosynthesizing to the stem, the trunk bit, which is generally brown, although that's general. You want at least 60% of that of your tree to be live, or to be that photosynthesizing part of it. And conifers, like someone mentioned, for pruning, it's going to be a little bit more than that. Just kind of a little species dependent. You can prune, or you can do a little bit more or less, but that's in general guide. We talk a little bit, I mean, this is maybe a little too technical, but when you're cutting off branches, you generally want to have it be so that if your orange is the branch you're cutting, that this main stem is at least 3 times as big as that branch. That's for a few different reasons. A big one is then you're not shocking the tree as much versus if it's a 1-to-1 and then you're taking off half of that tree, or half of a significant portion of that tree. So it just helps the tree recover a bit more. You can do it if it's smaller than that, of course, too. And obviously no situation's perfect, so we adapt. But that's recommended because then the tree can handle that big shock and seal. So here's a couple images. So the picture on the left is codominant, so that's about a 1-to-1 ratio. So you would, if possible, you wouldn't want to prune that entire branch back. You'd want to do a suppression cut or a reduction cut, which we might talk about. Basically cutting off part of that branch further out and letting the other one grow until it was a 3-to-1. The one on the right, that's a great example. You can easily cut that too. And you can see here toward the end where they cut it out, how the wood and the tree vasculature has grown over and around that. So it's compartmentalized. There's a little decay that's there and it'll stay there, but overall the tree's pretty healthy. But the tree actually has specific compounds right where that branch attachment is that allows it to know, hey, I'm going to seal this over. They don't heal, it won't start growing a new branch from that point, just like ideally like it was before, but they will seal it over, as you can kind of see in that cut. Yeah, so safety practices while pruning, there's a lot you can get into, but basically we mentioned the power lines. It's great to prune where someone knows what you're doing. Or if you have a buddy there. There's safety equipment, glass is always recommended. We do have these things called bypass pruners, which are great. Where did I put those? They're different than anvil. We don't recommend using anvil pruners because anvil pruners, the way the blades are designed is they pinch together. What they do is they actually crush the stem, which can be good for other plants, but not this. But bypass pruners are something like this, where you can see that the blades pass by one another, hence bypass, and that creates a nice clean cut that the tree can deal with versus if it's a jagged, ripped, torn out. Yeah, we recommend, if for your own, unless you're super comfortable or a certified arborist, up to 2 inches with, your feet both firmly on the ground. Again, what you do on your private land is your private land, but just some fun safety guidelines, fun safety. And then here are those bypass pruners. People use loppers. Handsaws are another really good one. A lot of arborists use. And there's different styles you can get where it cuts on the push out, but there's one that cuts on the pull, which is actually, for me, quite a bit easier, but I know people that like the other style. So yeah, lots of different tools that you can use to have in your arsenal or share. Do you have a tool library up here? Not yet? Not yet. Not yet. Yeah, so kind of here's another look at, so trees don't heal, they just seal. So you notice over here, it kind of looks like a C. So there was a branch here that came out and then the tree sealed around it. It kind of looks like it's creating this rounded area. You can kind of see it a little bit here too, although this is more dramatic. It's looks like lava that's kind of creeping in. So it'll seal that off and compartmentalize the decay. So depending on the extent, and the species. Trees actually have these built-in kind of compounds and simplify it, like they compartmentalize, so they have like little areas where they're like, oh no, you're not going to get through there anymore, decay. And so that can help it. So it looks like there's this giant wound, and then inside the tree it has just kind of cordoned it off. And shrubs are a bit different. So this we're talking mostly about like trees, large trees, small trees, although what is a tree is a little bit of a debate. I won't get into that philosophy today. And so here's some things to avoid. So we'll talk about how to avoid this, but bark ripping or tearing. So it's kind of like a really bad hangnail where you cut through just enough for there to be this little tear out. And then you're opening that up to decay. You don't want to cut just like right up next to the stem. It's called flush cutting, because that can open up pockets of decay too. A lot of people think it looks nice, and it does look really nice when you do it. And then you come back like a week, a month, 2 years later, and you're like, oh, it doesn't look good anymore because there's decay. And then sometimes if you leave too much of the branch left, if the fungus and stuff will start growing in here, the branch dies. And then because it was cut too far out, the fungi now have this nice pathway into the tree. Versus if you cut along what's called the branch bark ridge right here, where it has specialized sealing compounds, it will naturally it'll seal that off and prevent the decay from coming in. So it's kind of like, talk about like the Goldilocks, don't cut too far in, don't cut too far out. And you'll have to do a few pruning sessions or prune a few branches before you feel comfortable. And then if you're cutting further out, basically don't cut into the bud. Don't leave a big stub, but don't cut into it. So kind of another Goldilocks. And that's more important on to prevent disease and decay from getting in there. Deadwood can be a great thing to take out and to mark, especially now, to mark out which ones are indeed dead. But if it's something in the way back of your yard and there aren't any like kids playing or whatever, you can leave it for wildlife. Deadwood has a huge purpose. I mean, it's in forests all the time. It's just when it gets to be in town or in your yard that it's a bit more of a concern. All right, and then temporary branches. Anybody know why a branch would be called temporary? I love that somebody said, because I haven't pruned it yet. Yeah, there you go, done. My work is done. Temporary branches. So they're temporary only because, we haven't pruned them yet, and not all branches are temporary or you'll prune. But they're typically branches that are under the 15 feet, which will be what they call permanent canopy. So they're temporary really only for us in our human terms. The tree's like, oh, it could be here forever, but we prune it up typically for clearance. And then that fun fact, cladoptosis, if you're a word nerd, is how trees naturally shed their branches in the environment. So, we're not the only ones who prune trees. They do it to themselves too, in a way. So that's cool. And temporary branches, maybe a lot of you probably know this, but so if a tree grows and there's a branch 3 feet from the ground, in 10 years, that same branch is going to be 13 feet from the ground. No, just kidding. It's still going to be 3 feet from the ground. A lot of people think, it grows up like grasses or other plants or tomato, it just keeps growing and that branch will get higher and higher. But if you've ever seen somebody carve their name, like I love myself, into a tree, it stays at that same height and you can come back every year and just love yourself that much more. And so branches, so you want to cut those off, the temporary ones. And then we talk about permanent canopy above that. A lot of people, it's a bit of a personal preference sometimes for aesthetic reasons, but cut off branches that are rubbing together because then they can cause wounding and invite in decay. It's a bit of an arborist's debate some days with people I know. But downward branches, maybe it's a downward branch that's going to grow into something, and you want to snip that out. Sprouts and suckers, these don't have the same chemical compounds that a true branch would have, and so they're not woven together the way that the branch and the trunk or the main stem meet in a normal branch, for lack of a better term. They kind of weave together the fibers. Sprouts and suckers don't do that. So you can prune up almost to the flush cut with the tree on these because they don't have those compounds to protect And you want to make the smallest wound possible too when you're pruning. I think I have that coming up. Yeah, so there's some suckers too. Things like lindens, you're going to see a lot around town if you have those growing. Some species just sucker more. Sometimes it's a sign like of the ash tree we saw earlier that there's an issue. Sometimes it's just like, yeah, that happens. All right, just have a couple minutes. Reduction cuts will kind of buzz through. Basically, that's a style of cutting back the branch partially so that you can, so that this, you're not making as much of a traumatic removal by removing the whole branch at one time. Typically you remove, it's like a partial removal and then a full removal, maybe the next year, maybe the next 5 years. And that's a great option. So you can prune a lot, but over time. Again, depending on if it's your tree or if it's a tree you only see every 5 years, you might prune a bit more aggressively if you're not there as often. And this just shows reduction cuts. So like this is a co-dominant situation. See, they're about the same size and we want to keep one of them. So we chose the one on the right. So in order to make it so this ratio we mentioned earlier is more like this one's 3 times as large as this one, we're going to reduce this branch, which will slow down how faster it grows diameter wise here, while this one on the right can keep growing. And so eventually this will be 2-3 times as big. So you can come back and do a second cut down here and remove the whole thing. And again, that just helps the tree kind of recover. It's not going to be as shocking to it. And it still has opportunity to photosynthesize a bit to help seal those wounds. Just some more reduction. You can do one big one, or you can do a few smaller ones. Aesthetically, a lot of people like the smaller ones because it's not as dramatic on one spot. So it looks a little nicer, but it's to each their own. Okay, and then there's a lot of words on the slide, but basically when you're managing brush or you're planting brush, to Victoria's point earlier to, please don't move it using it as firewood, depending on species, of course, but try and use it on site or have a plan for your compost or something like that, or have the city cleanup days, things like that. That can be great, and keeping them organized and manageable. Always fun. We mentioned this is a great thing to look out for if you're looking for firewood, although depending on where you live here, you may have plenty already on your land. Cool. All right. So that's everything for me. That's a lot. I didn't talk about. Thank you.